The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across our family farm as I walked past the old hay wagon for what must have been the 1,000th time. It had been sitting there for as long as I could remember, weathered and forgotten, its wooden sides grey with age and neglect. But something felt different that day. Maybe it was the way the sunlight hit the worn wood, or perhaps it was simply that restless feeling that comes with having nothing pressing to do. Whatever it was, I found myself stopping, really looking at the wagon for the first time in years. My grandfather had used it decades ago, back when our farm was primarily focused on hay production. Now we raised cattle and grew corn, and the old wagon had become little more than a landmark, a reminder of simpler times. The wooden bed was partially filled with old tools, rusted chains, and various farm implements that had been tossed there over the years. It had become a sort of outdoor storage unit, a place where things went to be forgotten. But as I stood there, curiosity began to gnaw at me. I climbed up onto the wagon bed, my boots making hollow sounds against the weathered planks. The wood creaked under my weight, but it held firm. Dust motes danced in the afternoon light as I began to shift through the accumulated debris of decades. Most of it was exactly what I expected. Old hand tools, coils of rope, and various metal implements whose original purposes had been lost to time. As I worked my way deeper into the pile, I began to find things that sparked forgotten memories. An old leather harness that must have belonged to one of my grandfather's workhorses. A wooden-handled pitchfork that I vaguely remembered him using when I was very young. Near the bottom of the pile, wedged between two rusted pieces of equipment, my fingers found something unexpected. It felt like wood, but smoother than the rough-hewn tools around it. I carefully extracted it and found myself holding a small wooden box, about the size of a cigar box, with intricate carving on its lid. The box was surprisingly well preserved. The wood still retained some of its original luster, and the carved design, a pattern of wheat sheaves and farm animals, was clearly the work of a skilled craftsman. There was no lock, just a simple brass clasp that had turned green with age. My heart began to beat faster. In all my years on this farm, I had never seen this box before. It clearly didn't belong with the other tools and equipment. Someone had placed it here deliberately, hidden it away for safekeeping. But who? And more importantly, what was inside? I glanced around the farmyard, suddenly feeling like I was being watched, though I knew I was alone. The rational part of my mind told me this was probably just some old keepsakes, perhaps family photos or documents. But another part of me whispered that this could be something more. With trembling fingers, I worked the old brass clasp. It was stiff with age and corrosion, but eventually gave way with a soft click that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet farmyard. I lifted the lid slowly, half expecting it to be empty. Instead, I found myself looking at a collection of items that immediately told me I had stumbled onto something significant. The box was lined with faded velvet, and nestled within were several objects: a tarnished silver pocket watch, a small leather journal, a handful of old photographs, and beneath it all, a thick envelope with my grandfather's name written across it in careful script. I picked up the envelope first, noting how heavy it felt in my hands. The paper was yellowed with age, but the handwriting was still clearly legible. It was addressed to Thomas Mitchell, my grandfather, but there was no return address, no postmark. Someone had delivered it by hand. I set the envelope aside and picked up the pocket watch. It was beautiful despite its tarnished condition, with an intricate engraved design on the case. When I opened it, the face showed Roman numerals and the hands were frozen at 347. Inside the case, there was an inscription: "To my dearest Thomas, with all my love, M.R. 1952. M.R. My grandmother's name was Sarah, and my grandfather's sisters were named Helen and Ruth. I couldn't think of anyone in our family with those initials. Who was MR, and why had my grandfather kept a watch from her hidden away in an old hay wagon? The small leather journal was next. Its cover was worn smooth with handling, suggesting it had been opened many times. I opened it carefully, aware that I might be the first person to read whatever was written inside, since it had been placed in this box. The first page bore an inscription in the same careful handwriting I had seen on the envelope. For Thomas. May you always remember the summer that changed everything. With eternal love, Margaret Rose. Below that was a date, June 15th, 1952. Margaret Rose, MR. The same person who had given him the pocket watch. But who was she? My grandfather would have been 22 in 1952, just a few years before he married my grandmother. I turned the page and began to read. The entries were brief but evocative, painting a picture of a summer romance that had clearly meant the world to whoever Margaret Rose was. She wrote about long walks through wheat fields, stolen kisses under star-filled skies, and dreams of a future that apparently never came to pass. Thomas took me to see the old oak tree today, one entry read. He says it's been standing for over 100 years. He carved our initials in the bark, right next to where his grandfather had carved his own name decades ago. Each entry revealed a passionate relationship that seemed to have been cut short. Margaret Rose wrote about having to leave, about circumstances beyond their control, about promises to stay in touch that both of them seemed to know might be impossible to keep. The final entry was dated August 30th, 1952. Tomorrow I leave for Chicago. Thomas says he'll wait for me, but I can't ask him to do that. Maybe someday, when he's older and his life has taken the path it's meant to take, he'll read these words and remember that for one perfect summer, we believed in forever. Beneath the journal lay a small stack of black and white photographs. I lifted them carefully, knowing that I was about to see faces and scenes from a hidden chapter of my grandfather's life. The first photograph took my breath away. It showed my grandfather as a young man, but not as I had ever seen him in family pictures. In this photo, he looked relaxed, genuinely happy in a way that seemed different from the dutiful contentment I remembered. He was sitting on what appeared to be the front porch of our farmhouse, though it looked different, younger, with more trees around it. Beside him sat a beautiful young woman with dark hair and bright eyes, her head resting on his shoulder. She was wearing a simple summer dress, and both of them were looking directly at the camera with expressions of pure joy. On the back of the photograph, someone had written, Thomas and Margaret, July 1952. The subsequent photographs told the story of their summer together. Margaret helping with farm work, her dress hem muddy but her smile radiant. Another showed them at what appeared to be a county fair, sharing cotton candy and looking for all the world like any young couple in love. In one particularly touching image, they were standing by the old oak tree Margaret had written about, and I could actually make out the carved initials in the bark. The last photograph in the stack was different. It showed Margaret alone, standing by a train station platform with a single suitcase at her side. She was looking back over her shoulder at the camera, and her expression was heartbreaking, a mixture of longing, regret, and resigned determination. On the back, someone had written simply, "Goodbye," with no date. With the photographs carefully set aside, I finally turned my attention to the thick envelope. My hands were trembling as I carefully opened the flap, mindful that whatever was inside had been waiting for over 70 years to be discovered. The envelope contained several items. First was a letter, written on what had once been high-quality stationery, but was now yellowed with age. It was addressed to my grandfather and dated September 15th, 1952, just 2 weeks after Margaret's final journal entry. As I read the letter, the full story began to emerge. Margaret had been visiting relatives in our county for the summer, a city girl taking a break from her life in Chicago. She had met my grandfather at a church social, and what had begun as casual friendship had quickly blossomed into something much deeper. But Margaret's family had plans for her, an engagement to a wealthy businessman's son, a marriage that would secure their social standing in Chicago's elite circles. Her summer romance with a farmer's son was seen as nothing more than a temporary dalliance. "I know you'll think I'm a coward for leaving without saying goodbye in person," she wrote. "But I couldn't bear to see the hurt in your eyes, couldn't trust myself not to throw everything away for one more day with you. My family has made their expectations clear, and I have obligations that I can't ignore, no matter how much my heart rebels against them." The letter went on to explain that she was enclosing something else. A newspaper clipping from the Chicago Tribune's society pages announcing her engagement to Harrison Whitmore III, heir to a steel fortune. But there were more letters in the envelope, suggesting the story had continued beyond that announcement. The remaining papers painted a picture that was both heartbreaking and inspiring. There were several more letters from Margaret, spread out over the course of nearly 2 years, each one revealing more about the path her life had taken after leaving our small farming community. The first few letters, written in late 1952 and early 1953, chronicled her struggle to adapt to life as the fiancée of a wealthy man she clearly didn't love. She wrote about elaborate parties where she felt like she was playing a role, about wedding plans that felt more like funeral arrangements. "Harrison is kind enough," she wrote in one letter, "but he speaks to me as if I'm a beautiful ornament he's acquired for his collection. He doesn't know about the girl who spent a summer learning to drive a tractor, who helped bring in a harvest, who discovered that her hands were capable of real work." But then the tone of the letters began to change. In the spring of 1953, Margaret wrote about having doubts, about realizing that she couldn't go through with a marriage that felt like a business arrangement. The most shocking revelation came in a letter dated June 1953. "I've broken the engagement, Thomas. I couldn't go through with it. The scandal has been tremendous. My family is furious. Harrison's family is threatening legal action, and Chicago society is buzzing with gossip about the Mitchell girl who threw away the catch of the century." Margaret had written that she was planning to return to our area, hoping to rebuild the relationship she had abandoned. But then the letters stopped abruptly. The last one was dated August 15th, 1953. "Something has happened that changes everything. I may not be able to return as planned. Please know that my feelings for you never wavered, even when my courage did." After that, silence. I carefully placed all the items back in the wooden box, my mind racing with questions. What had happened to Margaret Rose? Why had my grandfather never mentioned her? And most importantly, why had he kept these mementos hidden away rather than destroying them? That evening I spread everything out on my kitchen table and began to study each item more carefully. The discovery had left me feeling unsettled in a way I couldn't quite explain. It wasn't just the mystery of Margaret's fate. It was the realization that I had lived my entire life on this farm without knowing about what was clearly one of the most significant relationships in my grandfather's young life. I decided to do some research. If Margaret Rose had been from Chicago, if she had been part of high society there, surely there would be some record of her. The internet made it possible to search historical records in ways that previous generations couldn't have imagined. The next morning, I began my search in earnest. Armed with Margaret's full name and the knowledge that she had been from Chicago, I started combing through online records, historical databases, and digitized newspaper archives. Margaret Rose Mitchell had indeed been part of Chicago's social scene in the early 1950s. I found several mentions of her in society pages, always described as the lovely daughter of industrialist Robert Mitchell. The announcement of her engagement to Harrison Whitmore III had been a major social event. But then, just as Margaret had described in her letters, I found a small notice: the engagement of Miss Margaret Rose Mitchell to Mr. Harrison Whitmore III has been terminated by mutual consent. It was dated June 20th, 1953. After that, the trail went cold. Margaret Rose Mitchell simply disappeared from Chicago's society pages. What I found next stopped me cold. A death certificate filed in Cook County, Illinois, dated September 3rd, 1953, just 2 weeks after her last letter to my grandfather. Margaret Rose Mitchell had died at the age of 22, less than a month before what would have been her wedding date. The cause of death was listed as complications from pneumonia, but something about the sparse details made me suspicious. I searched through newspaper archives for any mention of her death, any obituary that might provide more context. What I found was a brief death notice in the Chicago Tribune, just a few lines mentioning that Margaret Rose Mitchell had died unexpectedly after a brief illness. There was no mention of the broken engagement, no details about her final weeks. But I also found something else. A small news item about a young woman who had been found unconscious in Lincoln Park, apparently having collapsed while walking alone late in the evening. The woman had been taken to a hospital but died several days later from complications. The article didn't mention the woman's name, but the timing made me wonder if this might have been Margaret. The more I researched, the more I realized that Margaret's final months had likely been much harder than her letters had revealed. She had given up a life of privilege, had scandalized her family, and had apparently been trying to make her way in the world on her own, something that would have been extremely difficult for a young woman in the 1950s. In going through probate records, I discovered that Margaret had left a will that included a shocking bequest. To Thomas Mitchell of Millbrook County, I leave my father's pocket watch and personal papers, to be delivered only if he is unmarried at the time of my death. This wooden box and its contents were her final gift to my grandfather. I decided I needed to talk to someone who might have more insight into my grandfather's life during that period. My great-aunt Helen, my grandfather's younger sister, was still alive at 89 and living in a nursing home about an hour away. When I showed her the photograph of my grandfather and Margaret together, her reaction was immediate. "Oh my," she whispered. "I wondered what had become of her. Maggie, he called her, such a sweet girl, but so different from anyone else around here." Aunt Helen's memories filled in many of the gaps. Margaret had indeed spent the summer of 1952 with relatives in our county. She and my grandfather had met at a church social and had quickly become inseparable. The whole family could see he was smitten, Aunt Helen recalled. But we all knew she wasn't going to stay. She was educated, sophisticated, came from money, but oh, how happy he was that summer. According to my great-aunt, Margaret's departure had hit my grandfather hard. He had become withdrawn and had thrown himself into farm work with an intensity that worried his family. Then about a year later, Aunt Helen continued, a package came for him. Never did know what was in it, but after that he seemed settled somehow, like he had made peace with whatever had happened. He started courting your grandmother not long after that. The pieces of the puzzle were finally coming together. Margaret had indeed tried to return to my grandfather, had broken off her advantageous engagement and scandalized her family in the process. But illness and circumstances had prevented her from making it back to our small farming community. Her final gift to my grandfather had been to ensure that he knew the truth about her feelings and her attempts to return to him, but also to set him free from any obligation to wait for her. By the time the wooden box had reached him, she was gone, and he was free to build a life with someone who was actually there. I realized now why my grandfather had hidden these mementos rather than destroying them. They represented not just a lost love, but a turning point in his life. Margaret had shown him what it felt like to be truly, passionately in love. And perhaps that experience had made him a better husband to my grandmother. My grandmother had been a wonderful woman, kind, practical, devoted to her family and community. She and my grandfather had built a good life together, raised successful children, and been pillars of their community for decades. That life might never have been possible if he had spent years pining for someone who couldn't come back to him. But neither could he bring himself to simply throw away the evidence of what had clearly been the most intensely emotional relationship of his young life. So he had hidden it away, keeping it safe as a reminder of the path not taken. In the weeks following my discovery, I found myself seeing the farm and my family's history in an entirely new light. The old oak tree that Margaret had written about still stood in our south pasture, though it was showing its age now. I walked out to it one evening and found the carved initials she had mentioned, so weathered and grown over that they were barely visible. TM plus MR, 1952, was still there. I also began to notice things about my grandfather's later life that I had never paid attention to before. There were moments in family photographs where he seemed to be looking off into the distance, his expression thoughtful and perhaps a little sad. I wondered now if those were the moments when he was remembering Margaret. But I also saw evidence of the depth of love he had felt for my grandmother. Their wedding pictures showed genuine affection and commitment. The way he looked at her in family photos from their middle years showed respect, companionship, and love. It was different from the passionate intensity I saw in the photographs with Margaret, but it was real and lasting. I realized that my grandfather had been fortunate enough to experience two different kinds of love in his lifetime: the earth-shaking passion of youth and the steady, enduring partnership of maturity. Many people never experience either. He had been blessed with both. After much consideration, I decided to tell my father privately about the discovery. His reaction surprised me. Rather than being shocked or upset, he seemed almost relieved. "I always sensed there was something," he told me. Not another woman necessarily, but some experience that had shaped him in ways we didn't understand. It explains a lot about his character, actually. I decided to have the photographs professionally restored and the documents properly preserved. The story had taught me something important about the complexity of human experience. We tend to think of our ancestors as simple people who lived uncomplicated lives. But the truth is that every generation faces the same fundamental human experiences: love, loss, difficult choices, roads not taken. My grandfather made the right choice for his circumstances and his time. He honored the love he had felt for Margaret by keeping her memory safe, but he didn't let that memory prevent him from building a full and meaningful life with the woman he married. There's wisdom in that balance. I've also come to understand that every family has its secrets, its hidden stories, its chapters that never get told in the official family history. These stories don't diminish the love and commitment that define our public family narrative. They add depth and complexity to it. Sometimes I wonder if Margaret, wherever she is, knows that her story was finally discovered, that her love for my grandfather didn't disappear into complete obscurity. I like to think that she would be pleased to know that he went on to live a good life, that he became a devoted husband and father. The hay wagon still sits in the same spot where I found it, but now, when I pass by it, I think about the mysterious ways that the past reaches out to touch the present. Today, I keep Margaret's box in my study. Sometimes I take out the photographs and read her journal entries or study the pictures of my grandfather as a young man in love. Each time, I'm struck by the intensity of emotion captured in those faded images and carefully written words. Margaret Rose Mitchell was 22 years old when she died, but her love story lives on in faded photographs, careful handwriting, and the memories of a summer when two young people believed in forever. She gave up everything for love: her family's approval, her social standing, her financial security, and while that choice ultimately cost her everything, there's something beautiful about her courage. My grandfather carried her memory with him for the rest of his life, but he didn't let it define him. Instead, he used the experience to become a better man, a more loving husband, a more devoted father. In a way, Margaret's love continued to bless our family long after she was gone, shaping the character of the man who would raise my father, and through him, influence generations of our family. One moment of curiosity, one afternoon's exploration, opened up an entire world of human experience that had been waiting patiently for over 70 years to be discovered. It reminded me that behind every ordinary life lies extraordinary stories of love, loss, sacrifice, and hope. The old oak tree still stands in our pasture, its trunk now bearing the barely visible initials of two young people who loved each other with everything they had. It's a living monument to a summer that changed two lives, and in ways I'm still discovering, continues to shape our family's story today. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope Margaret and Thomas's tale touched your heart the way it has touched mine. Please take a moment to write in the comments below. I'd love to know what part of the world you're listening from and what family stories or hidden discoveries might be waiting in your own family's history. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this one. Until next time, keep exploring, keep wondering, and remember that sometimes the most extraordinary discoveries are hiding in the most ordinary places.